Well, hi, this is Tim Nations with Chemistry Staffing, and I'm grateful that you have joined us for this chemistry conversation. I'm excited to have a longtime friend and ministry contemporary, Trey Finley, with me. Trey and I were in youth ministry in the same area years ago. We did some graduate work together, and now Trey is the executive director for 1128 Ministries. And so, Trey, for those that don't know you and don't know what 1128 is all about, give us some background there.
Sure. It's good to see you, Tim, as always. I'm really glad our paths have continued to cross over the years. It's been pretty cool to watch that happen, like not once, twice, three times. It's like in 4 different iterations. So that's pretty great. So my name is Trey Finley, and I'm the executive director of 1128. 1128 exists to counter the causes and effects of burnout among church leaders. We do so using a suite of skills, if you will, that we call soul care. Primarily, we want to work with pastors to create deep and lasting friendships, to create space where they can share wisdom, and also where they can learn the contemplative practices that have kept our pastors and bishops and preachers and all of our church leaders well over the last 2,000 years. And so we take a great deal of joy in watching women and men thrive in ministry.
Boy, and and I'm not going to use the buzzword we've used about describing the last 18 months, but it's been a season that has included a pandemic, a contentious election, a riot in the nation's capital, heightened racial tensions across our country. And so, soul care to me is, it's always been a need, but I think the people's awareness of it is greater than it's ever been in a long, long time. And so as you guys have continued to pour into the lives and the souls of pastors and their families during this season, what are some of the things that you're seeing when it comes to taking care of pastors and their spouses?
Well, we are seeing an unprecedented number of folks who I think are losing joy in ministry. I think of all the things that we see, it's easy to talk about folks that are leaving, and there are many even leaving the church as a whole, and that also is a significant number. But I think the number one thing I see is a loss of joy among church leaders of all kinds. And in the midst of that loss of joy, we find a rise in anxiety, we find a rise in reactivity, and we find a rise in the kind of pain that we can cause one another. And yes, that is leading to a lot of ministers who are leaving ministry. It is, they didn't sign up for this in so many ways as a pastor. They didn't sign up for managing political disputes. They didn't sign up for having to close doors and try to figure out how to do masking and social distancing. They didn't sign up for this. And I think in that is a loss of joy. Some of them are finding opportunities to be a pastor all over again, and that's wonderful. And we see some of that as well. But in all of those cases, it's done in the midst of hardship that no amount of seminary or experience really could have prepared us for.
Absolutely. And I would say, what we're seeing in the job search space and in the ministry placement space mirrors exactly what you described. We're seeing a lot of men and women who are stepping away from ministry, and some of them will do that for good. And it's hard to see people making that decision when they've had such an effective, fruitful ministry for years, and the circumstances were greater than the soul care that was being administered to them during the season. So for any pastors and spouses that might be watching this, what message would you have for them? What would you say to them?
Well, it would perhaps be too cliche to say hang in there or pray more. I'm going to give a very practical thing that I think is one way that women and men together in ministry and their spouses can find a way to hold on to some joy and find some sustenance, some safe space, if you will. And here's that one suggestion. It's not the end all be all, but I think it's a really helpful strategy. I would encourage you to find something you love to do outside of ministry. Something that is just yours, that doesn't involve anyone from your church, doesn't involve anything done for your church, doesn't involve a program inside your church. It's yours. It's yours alone. And you are under no obligation to share that with others. That's not selfishness or greed. That is differentiation. That's the ability to say, I am more than what I produce. And in the midst of all of this pain over the last 4, 5, 6 years, we have been asked to produce in the midst of difficult circumstances in a time when I think producing wasn't what we were needing to do. It was actually helping people be still enough to recognize their own pain and some of the distance that we have created from each other. So I would say find something you love to do that you're passionate about and enjoy, that gives you joy, and make it just yours. I think you'll be surprised how well you will find just a little bit more stamina for what you have to do when you have a space that doesn't belong to the church.
So there's kind of two sides of that, right? There are the things that the pastors and their spouses and families can do to find that safe space to differentiate themselves. The other side of the equation is the churches themselves, the elder boards, the church leaders. What would you say, what maybe advice or recommendations would you give to churches that do want to care well for their pastors and their families?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is a great question because it kind of addresses both sides of the coin. The first thing I would say is to church boards and leadership, you need to assume that you are acting collectively out of anxiety and pain, and that wounded people wound other people. Um, that may seem foreign or strange, and you may be able to say, well, I see all these ways we're responding in healthy ways. And I would say that's very possible and likely for every board and every volunteer leadership group in a church. But we are all of us, still reeling from the impacts of, as you mentioned, all those things from the last 5 years, not least of which is the pandemic, which has really amplified all of those things. So I would just ask you, first of all, to assume you're acting out of at least some level of anxiety and pain, which you may not be able to quantify or even immediately assess in yourself. And the second thing I would say is, as cold as it may seem, lean into healthy policies. Because in moments when we are more likely to be reactive, if we have healthy policies as a church leadership, we can lean on times when we were in healthier space. And that allows us to make healthier decisions. That, of course, brings up the point, check your policies. How healthy are they? Are they staff-centric in a way that manages, maintains, and encourages healthy rhythms of rest and work?
Yeah, and I think that's great insight because I don't think most churches' responses to a season like we've been in is to check their policies, right? Everyone's shooting from the hip, everyone's trying to survive, and it could actually be some of the guardrails, some of the policies and procedures that you set up as a church that can provide the most protection, that can provide the most relief for people that are trying to lead through and coming out of this season. So I think that's fantastic advice. Let me ask you this, you guys are a resource to churches and church leaders in many ways. Is there anything that you guys have out currently as a resource? Is there anything coming up that whether they're a pastor and or a spouse, whether they're part of a church leadership team that is looking for ways to do this better, anything that you guys have out that you'd like to plug or promote?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. There's two things I want to point to, one for church boards, one for pastors. One for church boards is we just completed an ebook on both the theology as well as the practical side of writing sabbatical policies in churches. And I make the case there that actually sabbatical rhythm and rest, rhythm and work, rest and work rhythm. There we go. Rest and work rhythm should be the central tenet of every employee policy for a church. And you can download that ebook on our website, 1128, ELEVEN28.org. The other resource is we are taking a very realistic approach to what's about to happen in churches over the next 18 months. A lot of folks are already leaving, a lot more folks will. And so we've just begun a resource that we are creating from the ground up that will give ministers resources to both recover as well as restore some of what looks like emotionally and spiritually healthy lifestyles post-ministry. Because we feel like the church's obligation to those in whom they have trusted their spiritual growth should not end at the end of employment. That's a pretty business-centric model, and that's not the idea that we find in Scripture, where we are called to mutual care, regardless of who's paying who for what.
Well, and that really resonates with our commitment and our value to take care of candidates well. And some people find that as a church search firm that is being hired by churches, being so candidate-centric may seem a little different, but it comes from that same value, that same care for others that you see in Scripture. And we believe that, caring well for candidates is caring for churches, which is caring for the kingdom. And so I appreciate you guys really taking some leadership and providing some resources and guidance to help churches see beyond just the employment period and what that means for pastors and their spouses and what that means for the church at large. We'll be sure to include a link for those things in this post as well, so people can find that very easily. Trey, I just want to give you the last word. Anything else that you would say, maybe a question that I haven't asked during our time together?
Yeah, I think I would just close with a word of encouragement. There are a lot of reasons right now to look at the state of churches and the state of pastors and be discouraged. The declining numbers in churches, the few people who are returning to church, those numbers being much lower than they were in the vast majority of our churches. But I also want to point folks to some encouragement. Out of times of death and pain, we are promised in Scripture and really throughout the circle of life beyond the Scripture that resurrection and rebirth takes place after really difficult times of suffering and death. And make no mistake, we are in one of those seasons that will include the suffering and death of a lot of things that we have held dear. But there's resurrection to come. And that's the promise of the life of Jesus. That's the promise of the life of the church as it understood Jesus' story. And I think we can look forward to some ways that will happen in churches and among pastors if we'll pay attention.
Well, thank you for that encouragement. And thank you for spending some time with me today. Always good to catch up and connect. And we'll make sure it's easy for folks to find and get in contact with you if there's anything they've heard that really strikes a chord, so they can get access to your resources. So thanks for being here, Trey.
Thanks, Tim. Good to see you.
Mm-hmm.